Fatherland is a detective story. It just happens that the detective, Xavier March, is an SS Sturmbannführer. In 1964. What if the Germans won World War II is one of the more common alternate history starting points, and most of them proceed from the premise of the Nazis as a singular evil, qualitatively different from other regimes. Because World War II is really the creation story of the modern world, and myths need a good villain. But Fatherland brushes that aside for most of the story and instead looks at a 1960s Nazi Germany as a real post-war nation-state. It's not a grimdark caricature full of laughing sadists, nor is it a fascist fetish wonderland of high-tech cities populated by super-fit people. It's just a country that, like ours, survived a cataclysmic war and built itself up in the aftermath. Not so much the banality of evil as just the banality of modern life. Sturmbannführer March gets called in one morning on a day he's supposed to be off, but he takes the case anyway. March is divorced, lives alone, has limited visitation with his young son, and figures he's not doing anything that morning anyway, so he'll take the case and let his colleague Max Jaeger have breakfast with his family. A body was found floating in a river near an upscale Berlin neighborhood by an SS cadet out on his morning run. Not exactly a rare occurrence. There was nothing more routine than a body fished out of the Havel. It happened twice a month. Derelicts and failed businessmen, reckless kids and lovelorn teenagers, accidents and suicides and murders. The desperate, the foolish, the sad. But this particular bloated corpse is later identified as Dr. Josef Buhler, who had been state secretary for the general government in Poland during the war. The Gestapo, secret state police, take over the case. But March is already at Buhler's house when he gets the message over the radio, and he decides to go in for a look anyway because a few details don't add up. He finds Buhler's day planner, which includes a meeting with Wilhelm Stuckart and Martin Luther. Some of you may recognize those names and see where this is going. All three were attendees of the Wannsee conference, where some very dark decisions were made. Spicing up the crime, March has a witness, a young SS cadet named Jost, who says he saw Obergruppenführer Globoknik, head of the Gestapo and more commonly referred to as Globus, leaving the scene of the crime. Fatherland isn't a great detective story because we already know it's being covered up. But it is great alternate history, because in that world, the Soviet and American armies never liberated the camps. No horrifying pictures and film reels made it into public consciousness. Millions of people disappeared into those camps, and then the camps themselves disappeared. There is no capital H Holocaust, greatest crime of the 20th century. Only rumors about things that most people don't think about. Things that happened a generation ago. What Fatherland does is take Nazi Germany out of that mythologized realm of bloodthirsty, occult-influenced monsters bent on world conquest and drops it down in place of the post-war Soviet Union, a country that, while built on mass graves, just keeps going with urban sprawl and petty crime. The post office delivers bills and people go to work so they can pay them, and all the mundane details of life go on with the state as a background for everything. Mostly it's just there, but it can quickly take your life and liberty if you draw its ire, whether deliberate or accidental. It could even be argued that Fatherland presciently splits the difference between the Khrushchev-Brezhnev eras of the Soviet Union, when the Stalinist repression scaled way back and you could tell a joke about the government without getting gulagged, and early aughts America with surveillance of everyone's communications and the endless hunt for terrorists. They even have their own color-coded terror threat chart. Inside, beyond the SS sentries and the creaky revolving door, a board announced the current state of terrorist alert. There were 4 codes in ascending order of seriousness: green, blue, black, and red. Today, as always, the alert was red. And in this reimagined version of the Cold War 1960s, it's America and Germany locked in an ideological struggle. The remnants of the Red Army are the proxy supplied by the US to keep the war in the East going. The book doesn't get into what Germany is doing in response, but I would expect there are some National Socialist-aligned client states in the Americas playing the role that Cuba had in our history. The Middle East would be interesting as well. I've been meaning to write a book along those lines. Fatherland builds on the inherent overlap and dysfunction of the Nazi system. Xavier March is with the criminal police, investigating murders and crimes of that sort. They're part of the SS, which they would be. The SS had taken over the German police in 1936. Whether the Kripo of 1964 depicted in this case would be wearing black SS uniforms with the pre-war armband is, I think, highly unlikely, but it's iconic, so we go with it. There are also the order police that deal with traffic issues and things of that sort, and several varieties of security police dealing with terrorism and political activities like subversive movements and whatnot. Even for a police state, Nazi Germany had a lot of flavors of popo. The book uses that in the story, with the heads of different police forces acting at cross purposes, sometimes through lack of information, and sometimes quite deliberately.
We needed Luther for questioning.
Why? The man was just a common criminal, wasn't he?
But it also speaks to the peculiar organization of that regime. It's showing us glimpses of the kind of government that ossifies around a system composed of overlapping and competing fiefdoms going back to the dual-state structure of Nazi Germany. Almost every government function had both a carryover from the prior era and a party equivalent competing for resources. Perhaps most dramatically, they essentially had two armies, one following in a direct line from the old German army going back to Prussia, and the other, the Waffen-SS, a Nazi party organ with its own recruiting, its own command structure, its own procurement chain. An org chart of Nazi Germany would look more like a series of Venn diagrams than a flowchart. To complete the story's setup, President Kennedy is set to meet with Hitler for a summit to improve relations between the two countries, scheduled for the dictator's 75th birthday celebrations. That's Joe Kennedy, not John. Several American journalists are in Berlin to cover the events, including Charlotte Maguire, who proves to be quite adept at leading March around for her own ends. All the while, they're one step ahead of the Gestapo, who are passing off the whole thing as an art smuggling ring dating back to the war. But even as March finagles a 24-hour visa to go to Zurich under close watch the entire time, and he and Charlie, as she prefers to be called, narrowly escape the Gestapo, there's a building sense of inevitability. It's a world where everything leaves a paper trail. Signing in, showing ID. March himself, as a policeman, asks people for information about the comings and goings of potential suspects, and they eagerly inform. Everything he does is watched and recorded. By the time he calls in a favor for access to a government archive looking for a paper trail that explains what the dead party big shots were involved with, he's left a trail of paper behind him that he can't escape from. There's a layered, constant theme of the deadliness of bureaucracy, the slow strangulation by rules and secrets that tighten with each new piece of information uncovered. You see how it goes, Max? I feel like a man descending stairs in the dark. First, the body in the lake turns out to be an Alterkampfer. Then his death is linked to Stuttgart's. Last night, my own witness to Globus's involvement, the cadet, Jost, was taken away by the SS on Globus's orders. Now it turns out that Stuttgart wanted to defect. What comes next? You'll fall down those stairs and break your neck, my friend. That's what comes next. And through this story of March and Charlie peeling back the layers from the stolen art to a meeting of key functionaries in January of '42, and finally to train schedules and mass execution methods, there's a deeper exploration of how a totalitarian system breaks down normal human relations. Nearly everyone is part of a uniformed organization, from the fusion of the political organization, the SS, with the police, to organizations for young boys and girls, for adolescents, for factory workers and housewives and government clerks. The state inserts itself into families. March's son, Pili, personifies this idea of children of the state, uniformed little soldiers immersed in dogma and ready to report on their parents should they show signs of disloyalty. It's a country where everyone is scared. But it's still just a country. It's there, it has nukes, and America has to engage with it. There's a real chance for a reduction of tensions and a formal peace. Just as the world relaxed a bit with the détente of the Nixon-Brezhnev era, so too would that world see a similar thaw between Kennedy and Hitler. And setting the story against the backdrop of that meeting, using it as the ticking clock hanging over March, it also pits truth against peace. HBO made an adaptation of Fatherland, which I've been using clips of all through this. And it does the typical movie adaptation thing of giving us a heroic ending. They get the proof of an industrial genocide into the president's hands as he's on his way to meet Hitler. He looks through photos and documents and is so appalled he turns around right there, leaving the old painter standing in the torchlight alone with his mustache, wondering what he's going to say now that they've made such a big production of it. Voiceover tells us that it brought down the evil regime.
Without the American alliance, Hitler's Reich collapsed. Of course, there are some who say it never happened. Those who look and do not see.
The truth prevails, good guys win, yay us. The movie is fine for what it is. but it misses the point. In the book, March and Charlie have a desperate long-shot plan. She will drive under a fake identity to Switzerland. He will meet her at a hotel before the border crossing. If he isn't there, she is to leave at 8:30 so that she'll reach the border at 9. 9 is the hour when the beloved Führer of the German people leaves the Reich Chancellery to travel to the Great Hall. It's months since he's been seen, their way of building excitement. You may be sure the guards will have a radio in the customs post and be listening to it. If ever there's a time when they're more likely to just wave you through, that's it. March, of course, makes a classic mistake. He wants to see his son again, to somehow make him understand that the awful things they're going to say about him aren't true. Little bastard calls the Gestapo when they haul March in for some enhanced interrogation. Normally, we would arrest your son and threaten him as well to encourage your cooperation. But in your case, we know that such a course would be counterproductive. Secret policeman's humor. March holds up to torture because he knows that every minute he tells them nothing is a minute closer to Switzerland for Charlie. His entire existence becomes about buying time for her to escape, for her to get the truth out to the world. They even resort to the old let him escape during transport ruse, hoping he'll lead them to her. But his heroic act is to lead them the other way. She gets out with a thick stack of documents and photographs, but the book doesn't give us a happy ending where the truth and justice prevails. It's left unsaid whether it changes anything. No one is going to war over an atrocity that happened to foreigners 20 years ago. Germans aren't going to rise up and overthrow the regime over wartime actions against people that they wanted gone. Maybe it scuttles détente for a few years. More likely it's a scandal in the papers for a few weeks and then fizzles into the fog of everything else that happened in the war and all the issues of the day that need to be addressed. This lingering sense that no one will care, or that they'll find it convenient not to, is deliberate, as the author Robert Harris explains.
I was haunted by the idea that actually if in the 1960s there'd been a great pressure in America for détente, come on, it's a good thing, peace, we coexist in the world, that anyone who'd said, yeah, but hold on, what about all these millions of people that are missing? They'd have just been, oh, you're living in yesterday. We must move on. It's time. Draw a line under that. And that's what happens with the people who died in the Gulag and the Terror. That's what happened to the people who died in the Cultural Revolution and the Great Famine. They're just, and so it's a quite shocking concept to say, well, the same would have happened in the Holocaust. Frankly, everyone would have just said, the camps would have gone, there would have been no proof. Oh, just shut up, stop going on about it.
Governments only care about atrocities when it serves their purposes to care. Our enemies are monsters that do horrific things. Our allies, well, maybe they made some mistakes, but nothing like those guys. And really, that's the primary reason we have a more visceral reaction to Nazi imagery than Soviet. You can make communist t-shirts and speak of the regime's successes in polite company, but pop culture fun Nazis are beyond the pale, at least in the West. The cultural reaction is different in places like Japan that were on the other side of that war. You can read Fatherland as a well-structured alternate history framed as a crime thriller, and it's a good read. But if you read it on its terms, let yourself become immersed in its world without clinging to ours, it brings up some uncomfortable truths and questions. How far would you go in the pursuit of justice for people long dead, and how many lives are you willing to sacrifice in the process? Charlie does escape with the evidence, and March does get his heroic last stand, but it's an open question whether it achieves anything. I mean, it would be kind of darkly hilarious if the revelation heightened tensions between the US and Germany into a spiral of hostility leading to nuclear war and ruin for all. But more likely it would just put the US in a stronger bargaining position to get some concessions from Germany in exchange for a formal peace and leaving the Russians in the cold. At least, that's what our history suggests.
Listen, son, you're a big man. Now you need to learn to think for yourself.